the country, one of the things you realize real quick is that, at least for us, our mailbox gets nailed by the snowplows every year. So it's just a thing, you're going to replace it. And usually if I call up the village office and say, hey guys, you nailed my mailbox again, they're really good about coming out and replacing it. But last year, for whatever reason, when they replaced the post, they decided that this and I've had a mailbox that for the last year won't close, just because it doesn't line up, as you can tell. So if I have to replace it anyway, why not do something fun with it? What we're going to do today is we're going to do some Tole painting. And what's great about Tole painting is it looks a lot more impressive than what it actually is. Honestly, before you look at this and go, I can't do that. If you can color in a coloring book, you can absolutely do this. It is accessible to everybody, and I'm going to show you the technique of how to make things look a lot more fancier than they really are. Begin by gathering your supplies. You're going to need your pattern, acrylic paint, tracing paper, your brushes, and the surface that you are going to paint. Begin by first enlarging or reducing your pattern to fit the surface that you're going to paint. Then, with the reduced or enlarged pattern, begin by tracing that pattern onto your tracing paper. If you're working on a dark surface as I am here, I highly suggest base coating your surface. This is the difference between doing 3 or 4 coats of your color acrylic versus doing 14 coats to make it opaque. Now with Tole painting, the purpose is that we do not get ridges. To that end, we work from the largest portion that we're painting outward, so that by the time we get to that outer portion, we don't have as much paint on our paintbrush, so we avoid the ridges. Here we're going to use some of the black paint just to create a border to neaten up our edges. One thing I did forget to mention is before we ever apply any of these paints, for the mailbox, it does have a finish on it. So in the area I was painting, I did take a little sandpaper and rough it up so that we could have a little area where the paint could grip to. So if necessary, you will have to adjust your surface. You may have to scuff up the finish that's on your surface in order to get it to take. Here we're going to take our pattern that we've traced and we are going to position it where we want it onto our surface. Here what I suggest is if you have some painter's tape, the blue painter's tape, I put that down usually at the top where I want it to be. That way if I have to lift it up, it's still stuck there so I can put the graphite paper underneath it. We are going to outline just the outside or the outline of the pattern. Do not worry about the details at this point, as they're going to be painted over if you put them in. Base coat your image, your major image, just like we did the background, starting with the inside going out. Use the biggest brush that you can to avoid making lots of little brush strokes or ridges in your finished painted piece. One thing I do want to mention, you may have a lot of difficulty finding the exact color that your pattern calls for. A lot of these books were written in the late 80s and the early 90s, and those paints are just not available at the big box stores anymore. Look at your pattern and find the closest that you can to match it. you will find that more than likely you won't be able to tell that you didn't use the exact paint that they called for. I used just what I had on hand, and it looks exactly like the painting that is on the pattern I have. And putting the graphite paper down underneath it, transfer all the details to our now base coated image. Then we can start to do highlighting. Highlighting is very easy. What we do is we find our big brush or a large brush to fit the area. We're going to dampen our brush. So get it wet, wipe it off in a paper towel so it's damp. Then what we do is we take just a portion of that brush, a very small portion, and we're going to dip that small portion into our acrylic paint, our color acrylic paint that we're going to highlight or shade. What we do then is we keep walking it out, and by walking it out, I mean we just keep stroking it onto our palette so that paint uses the water on the brush in order to shade that paint all the way down the brush. We decide where our light source is, and that is where we are going to highlight, and on the converse side, we will shade on the other side. We're going to do the same with the shading that we did with the highlight, obviously on the side that would not get the sun. So what we're going to do is we're going to walk out that midnight blue, and we're just going to go along the edge of our painted piece so that we're creating the shading. The part that has the most paint on it is going to always go towards the edge because that is where the highlight or the shade would be the deepest. Also, don't be concerned that we're going into areas that we are going to later paint. By painting into these areas, it's going to make a smoother transition than if we were to then turn around and try to stop at that line. Just keep going right through it. We're going to thin this down as we keep brush stroking it till we get to the point that we like it. And then eventually we're going to paint over it. We will also do another shading at the end when everything's painted just to make everything cohesive. Okay, we are now going to begin by filling in or base coating the details of our pattern. Again, these were not the colors that were called for, so don't let that deter you. As long as you can look at the pattern and get something as close as you can to it or very similar, you'll be fine. And again, this is folk art. So this is your vision. If you want to paint it something completely different than what's in the pattern, go for it. It is your unique piece of artwork. Use the brushes that you have that will fill in the space as much as possible without going over. Here I have a 1/4 inch flat brush and a liner brush. I'm going to tell you these are some of the most useful brushes that you can own. You really, to start, only need about 3 brushes to start with. You need a large, maybe a 3/4 flat. You need a 1/4 flat, and you need a liner brush. These will serve you well until you start really getting into it. Another thing to mention is that you also have another end to those brushes. The other ends are very useful to dip into paint to make things like pupils or just round circles if you need a round circle for a project. Just dip the other end of your paintbrush in there and bring it straight down on your project, and suddenly you have the perfectly round pupil or center of a flower that you absolutely needed. Now, in general, we don't ever really want to work wet on wet because you will lift your paint. So when you need to dry in between coats, take your hair dryer and just run that right over your paint until it's dry. Let it cool, and then you can continue painting your shading, etc. Now, to put the blush in our Man on the Moon's cheeks, we're going to use a very small stencil brush. We want to make sure that it is absolutely dry, and we're going to take some of our paint and we're going to basically take as much paint off of that as possible. We don't want to be painting his cheeks as much as we want to be stenciling them. So as much as we can, we're going to take that paint off, and then we're just going to pounce it where his cheeks would be. And do use your fingers. Your fingers are almost like another paintbrush. I use them often to blur some of the lines that I've put in painting. And by the end of your painting session, your fingers are pretty much as dirty as your brushes. Now you're going to start doing your highlights just as you did the highlights for the edges of your moon and your shadows. Just follow your pattern. It'll tell you what colors to use, and you're just going to do the walkout of the paint just like we did before. Here you see the little dot where his eye is, his pupil is, and you see the little dot with the highlight. This was made by the other end of the brush. Continue to shade around where it's telling you to, where the natural shadows would fall, or where your pattern is directing you to. And our Man on the Moon's done. We highlight the stars, adding the highlight on one side and the shading on the other. And this is how it turns out. Now we'll move on to our lettering. I shrunk this down from this book and used the letters just like we did above, where I copied it over with graphite paper. And then I just placed it on my mailbox where I wanted it to be. You could, if you were very good at lettering, do this freehand. I am not, and I prefer to actually have a pattern. So I did this just like I did transferring the Man on the Moon. the same way, and then I just base coated it with a white paint. Feel free to do it any color that you want that will show up on your surface. I hope that you enjoyed the Tole painted mailbox tutorial, and I really do want to encourage you to give it a try. It's not as hard as it looks. Please, if you enjoyed this, give a thumbs up, like and subscribe, and join us again later for some more farmhouse crafts. We have a lot of fun here, and we make a lot of great things for your home.